and we wanted to provoke this. So the provocation has now been made, and Sophie is going to start. I think talk for about 20 to 25 minutes. Sue will follow, and then we'll have hopefully a vigorous round of questions and answers and discussions and comments, which we will jump in. So thank you so much, and thanks to both of you for coming.
Okay, thank you. Okay, first of all, sorry that we are late. We weren't entirely sure where we were going, and we're just on time. And we're geographers, so personally, I'm always lost. And I'm very impressed you're here when I hear that Julius Malema is speaking as well. So I'm going to begin my contribution to the seminar in a really personal place, and I hope you don't mind that. I'm going to speak to bits of my own story, because when I was given this provocation around race and place, and Bernard did it in a lovely way over a coffee, he said, "How come you don't write about race so much anymore?" That was a sort of informal version of that provocation. And so I started thinking, and so I just want to tell a little bit of my own story. I emigrated to South Africa a few days before the elections in April 1994, so a very privileged moment to move here. And my first job was teaching geography and history and all sorts of arbitrary things like gym in a high school in Cape Town, one that was classified coloured. And I started the job a few months after the elections, teaching in a moment that was really compelling. I was told by the teachers to toss out the old curriculum. I was very thankful, because the old curriculum was on things I didn't know anything about. And I was told to teach relevant, interesting geography and history. And it really was a period of reimagining, a period of seeking out really what people were calling cross-racial encounters, engaging with other schools, for instance. It was a high-spirited experience. So, for instance, I coached volleyball, and we went off to sports that had been deracialized, and we went off to play in schools, for instance, in Nyanga, where the schools had a double shift, and we squeezed our match in between periods of school. We went to former Model C schools, and I watched these kids' jaws just drop at the plushness of that sort of environment. So I could spin many stories from this experience, but it really was what grabbed me and started me off on a journey. And I hadn't done my PhD at this stage, but what grabbed me about teaching and living here and becoming an urban scholar here was this mix of a vision about engaging with race, the practice of how you think about it, immersed in and contributing to, in conversation with, making and creating change. So I went on to write, to research and write a PhD, which tried in small slivers to work through legacies of race and place that are bound up in poverty and bound up in states' attempts to intervene in those neighborhood contexts. And through that, looked at racialized histories and racialized lived everyday urban life that were written into relationships with the state, formally into laws, formally to accessing material resources, but were also clearly very personal, informal, deeply entrenched in relationships with local officials, in languages of access and every day, in the textures of the built environment, the home, in streetscapes and landscapes. So this, I could go on, and I probably have gone on too much, but this for me was a really interesting way and a context in which I was trying to write about race. And it was in a context where the literature really mirrored that interest. And Sue has a paper in 1995 with Alan Mabin, writing very productively and critically about the ways in which race was fronted in our approaches to the urban, to questions of segregation, to questions of local governance. So following, and very in quick shorthand, following my PhD, I was interested in working on projects which actually were not so embedded in these legacies of segregation. So I shifted my research to questions around social movements and movements that were actively trying to engage in a cross-racial, cross-segregation, cross-township neighborhoods, engaging in an agenda around working class issues and issues that confronted what they called this neoliberal city. And then, interestingly, in a way, there's a silence then in my writing around race, and this is a provocation which got me thinking. And one of the things that came out of that research was I decided to work very in a different sort of mode in reaction to working on this PhD, working in multiple sites across the city. I decided to take a collaborative approach organizations in this movement and work in one neighborhood. And it's a neighborhood which has opened up an interesting conversation that could be about race, but in my work hasn't been. And it's a neighborhood which was classified segregated, was classified colored in the past, and is a place where the activism in the neighborhood is departing from those historical legacies, and yet engaging them in lots of creative ways. Struggling with the state around claims based on that, the right to access housing, histories of housing, claims and relationships with the state, and yet also a place in which urban identities and the politics around which identities have mobilized are framed in conversations about land occupation, about participation in state structures, about identities around being the councillor and being ward forum members. So it's a really interesting place where the provocation for the seminar led me to think about the ways in which race is both incredibly present and yet absent. It's visible and a point of departure, yet invisible. And it is both the context in which agency is sought and crafted, mobilization is formed, and it's structurally so important, and yet in this literature which I'm writing on, it's quite silent. So that's a provocative context for me, which frames this seminar. Okay, so one of the place, my PowerPoint isn't working, so we won't, definitely, that's fine, we won't worry about that. But the second part of the provocation from Bernard for the seminar was to really reflect on how we understand these race geographies and state attempts to overcome spatial segregation. And I'm going to use, so that's really the point of departure for the work that I'm going to share much more specific empirical work. And I'm going to use as a provocation a piece by Jeremy Seekings, which he wrote in 2008, and it's entitled The Continuing Salience of Race, Discrimination and Diversity in South Africa. And in that article, Seekings uses Tellis's work on Brazil, and Tellis differentiates between what he calls vertical and horizontal notions of racism, arguing that in Brazil, race works in economic life despite ideologies and myths of racial democracy. But in Brazil, in terms of identities and interactions and social interactions at the micro level, Brazil is remarkably, and this is Seekings' summary, non-racial. And Seekings uses that as a point of departure here to say that that the continuing salience of race is surprising in several respects. And he says, first, the deracialization of citizenship and public policy, with some exceptions around fashion BE, has removed the impetus to racial identities that many scholars emphasize when discussing the South African past. So in a way, he's commenting on this on a similar tension or observation in my own work of talking quite actively about race and then not. And he goes on to say the vertical dimension of racism appears to have been largely eliminated or perhaps even reversed. So in this case, he's meaning that the ways in which race works structurally through state projects and through border driven by the state, he's claiming that citizenship has somehow eliminated and reversed that, while horizontal relations are still deeply racialized. So I'm not going to go into there, but I want to really unpack his contention that the vertical dimension of racism appears to be largely eliminated. That, in other words, the state granting rights and somehow concocting and working through and working on a project of non-racial policy through citizenship, that somehow this has, his work is eliminated. And I'm sure if he was here, it would be a much more complicated use. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share a particular paper, and it's a paper that I've written with a colleague on waiting for housing and on housing policy in South Africa. And I'm going to obviously complicate this notion that state projects aren't imbued with race. And what I want to do is trace, I'm going to come back to tracing how is race present and absent in this particular housing project of housing, and in particular in this case, waiting for housing. Okay? How is race claimed and central to agency and yet so structurally important? How is it as a historical legacy present and yet also reinterpreted and remade in the present. Okay, so we have an extensive literature on housing in the South African context, and we have lots of work on housing policy, we have lots of work on the lived experience of housing, and this paper really departs from a point which says, actually, in practice, the right to housing for the majority is actually that if we take the city of Cape Town, for instance, we have roughly, and the number is contested, but it's illustrative, we have 280,000 families registered in terms of claiming a need and being having a legitimate need for housing. And yet, on a good year, we deliver 8,500 units, approximately. Okay, so that's our point of departure. There's a gap in our literature, and so basically what we've been looking at is waiting, both policies around waiting, the everyday lived experience of waiting, and let me just make sure I'm in the right place. Okay, so what I'm going to do is trace through the argument of this paper, and the paper is not about race, but then sort of step back and say, okay, so what are the various ways in which this tension around race surfaces? Okay, so waiting on the one hand, registering for housing is absolutely normal, it's taken for granted. Even though it's very hard to access housing, it's a normal cross-generational experience that households across poorer areas of Cape Town opt for. So one of the things that we've done in this paper is we've used Asaf Bayat's work, and Asaf Bayat describes contexts like waiting for housing as quiet encroachments of the ordinary. That the things that people have to do while they're waiting, that while they're aspiring to have a house, while they're aiming and strategizing or waiting in various forms for housing, is to live in the meanwhile, to live in what we all know in this context are backyards, informal settlements of various types, overcrowded housing. And Asaf Bayat usefully, I think, we have a lot of literature on mobilizing for housing. But waiting is not mobilizing. So he gives us a really useful language for thinking about waiting. And he describes it as non-collective but prolonged direct actions of dispersed individuals and families trying to acquire the basic necessities of life. So these are families making do, living in the meanwhile, in all sorts of interstitial spaces in the city. And clearly this is more than a technical status. So Yiftishal, in a 2009 piece, calls this permanent temporariness, the tension of permanent temporariness. And here we talk to these as modalities of waiting. So what does it mean to wait? What are the contexts in which we know what the contexts in which people wait are, and we have a lot of literature on that. But what does it mean for everyday life? What does it mean for making? We have all sorts of interesting comments from in this neighborhood where I've been working for a long time, where we've done this work, that it makes you like a perpetual child. You're living with your parents. You are not a child, but you still live in the constraints of being a child. You live as a ward of the state. You are claiming to be a beneficiary, but you're in this often illegal context or precarious context in the meanwhile. You are frustrated. What does it constitute to be in this temporariness? You're unstable, you're unrooted. You're living what Ndebele, in a really wonderful book, The Cry of Winnie Mandela, describes as an absence without duration, okay? Or Jeffrey describes as modalities of being in the middle. Okay, so in a way, those modalities, this politics of living in the meanwhile, they both reflect racial geographies of our city. They're happening in former group areas, but they're more complicated towards macro geographies of segregation. They are remaking the city in this everyday practice of living in all sorts of ways. So there's a really rich literature on waiting, and what we've done in this paper is draw from lots of interesting work. Ayero, for instance, has written a book called Patience of the State, where he argues in the context of Buenos Aires that waiting for welfare, not housing in this case, but very parallelly, produces submission, that the practice of meeting this bureaucracy of the state, these material bureaucratic and social encounters, it's an experience of being kicked by the state, by meeting the ambiguities of what the state can and can't deliver, and the personal interactions around that. That's an argument where about political submission. Jeffrey, in contrast, in a very different context, in the Indian context, speaking to young men's both a cross-generational investment in education as a way for young men to find employment, that when they meet the realities of unemployment, that's an experience of waiting. And there he gives us lots of possibilities for thinking about the agency that people find in waiting. Okay, so we have in this context of waiting, in this context of the hope of having access to something which the state is delivering, that's a really essential, housing is an essential part of the state's project after apartheid, a project which doesn't claim to tackle desegregation, but certainly had elements of that in it. How does that then meet waiting? So that's one layer. We have a modalities of waiting, a politics of waiting in the meanwhile. In a way, housing policies and policies around waiting especially give us a conundrum where race and its legacies and its present embodiment really sits at the heart of it. If I had my slide here, I have a table where it looks at shifting local government's institutional changes from the 80s through to the present. And we obviously have a massive shift from the apartheid to democratic local government. But within local government, we have shifts that we have a period when we've gone from group areas and waiting lists being bound up, both in racial identities and what you accessed via racial identity or what you didn't access. But then are being bound up in the restructuring of local government into 6 metro councils, which are then restructured again into a metropolitan council, which are then is restructured in terms of the housing waiting policies from waiting lists to a registry. And we have a conundrum here where how do you create a non-racial policy? We have this state grappling and local officials and housing officials grappling with how do you create a non-racial policy, but you've got to use the racialization of housing access in the past to, in the initial phase, attempt to create a chronological list. A list where people who were on former colored group area waiting lists were moved chronologically, and that in itself was very challenging. And then if you were someone who was formerly classified African, you were inserted onto the list where you had evidence of you being in the city, and you had much more informal indicators of that. So we have a grappling with those lists. We have them being deployed and used in various ways. And then in the last 5 years, we've had this housing registry, which shifts the technology and the policy approach again, and basically uses multiple indicators, one of which is time waiting on the list, one of which is geographic area, the area of the neighborhood, the legacy of segregation, the built environment type, and the others which are other sorts of variables. Okay, so we have a really complicated set of policies, and one of the places where people's everyday experience meets that policy is that housing officials in the past could actually get access to a list. They could say, you know, you're 10th, or in this neighborhood there are 87 people ahead of you, or in the city there are X number of people ahead of you. Now with these shifting policies and their contingencies, that sort of access and that sort of notion of the list has shifted. Okay, so it gives us, so in practice, if we look at how do you actually access housing, you can wait, you can hope, but there's all sorts of other sorts of strategies which actually give you access to housing, perhaps bypassing the list, sidestepping the list, asserting yourself into a community-based driven beneficiary list, all sorts of strategies. And it's that sort of tension which I think is, which I'd like to turn to now, the ways in which waiting helps us think about a state process which has to engage with a heavily racialized terrain, engages the precarities and the really contingent ways in which people are negotiating spaces in the city, but combines that contention with a legitimate process driven by the state where people claim their rights and claim their place on the list, and there's a legitimate conversation and a formal and procedural conversation. But both elements of that are opaque. Okay, so if we're looking at waiting, in this case, what does waiting for the state help us see? It's immersed in the practices of ordinary practices of people trying to negotiate access. These stories also, though, tell us something about the state's institutional form, its organizational structures, its capacities. Its experience where policy and its implementation meets everyday experience. And what we're arguing really here is that waiting, these quiet encroachments of the ordinary are places in which people remake neighborhoods, remake settlements, remake their physical homes, but also encounter the state and make legitimate yet contentious claims on it. And Bayat, again, really persuasively calls this sort of work non-movement, right? A really important set of terrain which is not about mobilizing around a whole variety of identities. And he argues that the power of non-movement rests on the power of big numbers. That is that the consequential effects of norms and rules in society, of many people simultaneously doing similar, though contentious things, they really matter. That they have an effect of normalizing and legitimating acts which otherwise would be deemed illegitimate. So normalizing and legitimating acts which are both in finding a place and a way to be in the city, but also about encountering the state and negotiating policies and negotiating access. Okay, so I'm moving, how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, great. Okay, so how does this help us think about the state? How does this mix of contention and legitimacy help us think about state interventions in remaking the city, people's expectations of them and the everyday practice of them? Jeffrey, again, and in this case I'm quoting from this book called Time Past, he says that in the Indian context, ordinary people operate with a split notion of the state. On the one hand, they view the state as craven, partial, and a disorganized set of institutions. And certainly experiences of negotiating and trying to access housing, you could describe the South African experience of that similarly. But he goes on to say, on the other hand, they believe in the state as a sublime institution and a source of authority, rationality, and power. An equally useful way to take very seriously the state project and the legitimacy of claiming to be part of it. The state project as bound up in these everyday realities of living in limbo, living well, but also how you aspire and think about the future. We've drawn on this paper using Gupta's work in red tape around social violence that is enacted through everyday practices of bureaucracies. So here, that the promise of housing and the possibility of housing and the practice of waiting, which is the majority's experience of that, are both products of the state's commitment to a bureaucratic and technical rolling out of housing. So the state's project and its commitment to changing the city to, in various, sometimes direct and sometimes more obscure ways of addressing racial geographies. And Gupta argues further that bureaucratic action repeatedly and systematically produces arbitrary outcomes in its provision of care. So the state's commitment to provide care in terms of formal homes, they don't use that language, but using Gupta's language, is precisely why citizens wait. There's a consciousness that the state is arbitrary, there's a knowledge of the state's arbitrariness, there's a configuring in the arbitrariness, but despite that, its procedures are a few ways to access a formal home. Okay, so how do we think? For me, there's layers that help trace out the complexity of thinking about this couplet, race, place, in this mix. Okay, we have a complex story of a policy that aims to be non-racial, but uses racial legacies in which to try and produce non-racial access. Waiting itself, basically the argument of the paper is that waiting shapes this politics of encroachment, and the modalities of waiting, these encroachments, remake racial segregation in some ways and challenge it in other ways. But one of the arguments in the paper, and one of the things I would contribute to this conversation, is an attention to those micro practices is really important, to sit in the tension between race being visible and invisible, absent and present, and to work on a language for thinking about that. The second part of the argument in this paper is that waiting generates this politics of encounter with the state, that citizens both sidestep, bypass, as well as try to enable policies and officials these contingent, often opaque practices. Okay, and so race persists in the criteria. It persists in these legacies of institutional systems. It persists in official ways, in sometimes the continuity of officials across generations. Okay, although that sort of generation of official from the 80s is retiring. Okay, but at the same time, city housing policy and city interventions, state interventions in the city also are, they don't use the waiting list, they don't use the housing registry. There are all sorts of other complexities going on. So upgrades, which are targeted to particular areas, upgrades which engage with, or interventions in the city, which intervene in particular places and reshape how those processes work. So what we really conclude in the paper is that waiting reflects a paradox, what it means to demand and claim rights in this post-apartheid period, what it means to claim and be part of a procedural process, a legitimate process that is hinged on rights and citizenship, and yet which requires a form of subversion and a form of being invisible in the process of waiting. Okay, and what I think this, to return to the language that Seekings borrows from Brazil, this notion of a vertical experience of racism, or a horizontal experience of racism, what do these layers tell us? I think they certainly tell us we need to articulate a terrain between and beyond those notions, where and how race matters builds on these nuanced geographies that are embedded in networks, embedded in the terrain of neighborhoods, embedded in everyday lives, and that link up in messy and complicated ways with the ways in which the state intervenes in neighborhoods, runs programs, engages in things like the construction of a housing registry built on lists, and yet deploys and uses its ability to deliver housing in complicated ways that exceed those. So it asks us, 20 years on, what does it tell me about race? I think we need it's an interesting comment for geographers to return to the question of race, but to imagine race not as vectors, this notion of a vertical or a horizontal, race and its import, but rather perhaps as interwoven threads, sometimes that boldly anchor particular experiences, other times that are less visible. And I don't have a neat language for that, but I think that's really part of the project of thinking now.
Thank you so much.
So can I go straight on? Because then I want you to hold what Sophie's just been saying, particularly in that experiential dimension and in the contemporariness of what she's been saying. That's talking about now. And all of the resonance of what she's been saying there. What I want to try and do is to both take this longer time frame and perhaps also just to scale up what some of these interplays are between race and place. Yeah? And to do that, I want to locate the paper in work which I did for my PhD many years ago. One paper which is the Geographies piece that you were sent, which basically argues, and one come back and think about this is more resonant, is that race inequality was embedded in institutional structures like planning and local government. Yeah. And in that paper, what we argue is that race and the social construction of the category of race is a very blunt instrument through which inequality was spatially entrenched, and a partial and a distorted application of modernist ideas. I'm going to say that again, or say it slightly differently, and I'm going to put it into even more simple language to make it explicit. But I think I was arguing then, which I think I would hold to now, particularly as it manifests in the urban form, which is basically that what apartheid did at both the at the interurban and the intra-urban scales was that it divided black people from white people. And it did that not just by oppressing black people, but also by privileging white people. In other words, actively giving goodies to some people, not just taking goodies away from people. But it also, and this is the part that's not just comfortable for us to think on now, but I think it's really important in terms of the argument that we're going to make. It's differentiated through instruments of urban management, both modern and pre-modern, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a second. It differentiated between black people. Not all black people were treated in the same way. In other words, apartheid urban planning was an instrument of differentiation, both racial and interracial. And if we're going to come to terms with what that means in the long-term structuring of the city, it's absolutely imperative that we come to terms with that. And it means, and what I was trying to argue in that paper, is that I locate that in the set of, let's call them instruments, regulations, which were associated with planning. I'm a geographer, so planning is a kind of close cousin. Sociology is a second cousin removed, and throws a third cousin removed. Except for Sophie, then it's the other way around. But I think what the Jacqueline piece that I sent you to have a look at does is that it uses exactly the same sort of thing, but it uses infrastructure to look at how differentiation is implemented. So we can come back to that later on. Okay. So what I'm really interested in here is what are the institutional mechanisms that shape inequality. Now, I want to just, again, locate that 1995 piece. There were two things which were happening in the wider discussions about urban segregation at that time. The big kind of stuff that was done on segregation indices had been discredited, but there were two basic kind of camps which were alternative. The one was associated with a man called Julius Wilson, and which was really about America and the political economy of race. And the other was associated very largely with the racial construction of identity, like Kay Anderson, who were very, very formative at that moment. And in some ways what happens is that the post-structuralist writing kind of becomes more hegemonic, and some of the questions which I was talking about at that stage fell off the agenda. And part of what I'm doing now, and what this comes now from a paper that Owen Frankshire I just published in the book, is to look at why those ideas are beginning to resurge and how they might be continue to have some savings. Okay, so if we're looking at a 20-year period, partly what I'm arguing is that what we said then was right, and it needs to be nuanced. You want to hear me out, and some of you agree, you may not. Okay, so basically there are two arguments which come up in this. The first and foremost is that, particularly in the right of a lot of post-structuralist writing, the big bogey in the room became modernist discourse. Top-down, hegemonic thinking, which didn't allow for nuance, wasn't bottom-up, and located power in the state, and was almost always seen as being problematic and top-down. And so the first argument that I think we were making then, and I would reiterate now, is that actually that is really simplistic. Planning is not the sole cause of, nor is it the cure for segregation. Okay. Why do I say that? Well, because there are a whole lot of other macro forces, the political economy of labor markets, international immigration policy, demographic changes, all of these things can interweave. And I think anybody who sits back sensibly would argue that what states imagine or what states say they're going to do, even if they implemented it in their purest Foucauldian kind of logic, actually never happened in practice. Okay? It's more complicated than that. The racist discourse that we have of the apartheid city actually is all there is to it. And that's really important, because now we sit 20-something years later with what Sophie's just been describing, and we have to say, is it only because there are residual elements of racism and racist discourse, or are there other things which bind us through place in what are ultimately unequal structures? Okay. So it's a really important question in terms of how do we unravel this thing. And so it's with that in mind that I think that we need to return to the role of planning, and in particular to the role of modern planning, to think about what this is and what its role is in dividing cities, in fragmenting cities. And there's a general interest in the revival of planning. But I say, and I already indicated, for a long time people tried to distance themselves from planning. It was always seen as a kind of a top-down, hegemonic, deeply problematic kind of force. And so anybody who had vaguely progressive kinds of implications certainly didn't want to be associated with modernism, and they probably didn't want to be associated with planning. And associated with that, we see the demise of the state. In other words, the demise and the decline of the state in important parts of the world, particularly the global north, where the agent that propagated planning was not as strong as it used to be. So for all sorts of reasons, planning falls out of fashion. I might argue that northern cities were already planned, they didn't actually do terribly much. It's very easy for planning to become less important as a practice. But that has changed, not least because if you have a look at things like happening outside of your window, big fires, disasters, mega epidemics like Ebola, and so there has been international processes like the revising of the Millennium Development Goals, the resurgence of the idea that maybe there are some minimums that we actually want. Maybe there are some big ideas. We've got more of an appetite now for big ideas than we did, say, 10 or 15 years ago. It's not just the local that is important. And with that, there's been a resurgence of interest, both in planning and in the role of state. And those of you who've been studying the state, and you'll hear the resonance here with what Sophie's just been talking about, there's basically a huge, huge debate. On the one hand, we've got some people arguing things like, we need at least a minimally effective state to enable other kinds of things. You can't interact with a state that doesn't have some capacity. So even if you're a civil society movement, you need to know whose door you're banging on, and there ideally is a conscious presence behind that door, otherwise you're going to get nowhere. There is arguably an argument for long-term planning in terms of protection of public goods like environment, and the ecological agenda in particular has seen a resurgence of an interest in the state. So a resurgence of interest in the state. Set against that argument, which still holds, and you will hear very, very often put on. I love Phil Ennis. I love his phrase where he basically says, the best thing government can do is nothing. This idea that an absent state is an interfering state. That informality works, and that the poor are actually much better at organizing themselves, and actually don't need a state in any particular kind of way. Less government is good for the poor, says Samuel Escobar. Ferguson's argument that government misunderstands, interferes, and creates problems. So can you see we've got two very, very different kinds of ideas in that. And the discredited ideas about the state are very largely, not exclusively, but very largely attributed to the prevalence of modernist ideas. And the preeminent tool of modernism at the city scale is urban planning. Now, I want to suggest to you that actually we probably threw the baby out with the bathwater, and perhaps we need to have another look at the role of modernism and at the role of planning as a result of that. Partly because I think planning was singled out as the single most destructive element of modernism, and in fact is often conflated with it, to the point where quite often when people talk about modernism, they think of planning. They think of local government. And yet there are plenty of things which are associated with modernism, like anybody on medication in the room, anybody who goes to the doctor, anybody who came up in the lift. Those are all the products of modernism. Concrete technology, scientific medicine, large-scale engineering products, those are the products of modernism. And they haven't had anything like the same kinds of critical reflections. Okay, so it may not be modernism per se that is the problem. It may have been a particular set of applications of modern planning that we want to be looking at. And for me, it's particularly important that we go back and revisit the role of modern planning. Because my argument would be is that, in fact, what we probably have had is an incomplete application of modernism. I'm not suggesting for a moment that modernism is necessarily only a productive force. We have know and think about Nazi Germany to think about some of its very, very destructive elements in it. But the idea that modernism was necessarily a force for evil seems to me to be deeply problematic, and particularly apropos the question of race. And when we revisit that, I think we are able to open up the role that modernism played and has played not just in the South African city around race, but in the African city more generally. And just to give you two examples of whose work I think takes us in that kind of direction. On the one hand, you have people like James Holston, who I think point very cogently, and I think his work is absolutely superb. But it's very, very clear, perhaps as one of the most influential writers, about why modernism is so problematic. And he looks at the post-colonial context, and he looks at and uses ideas of modernism, top-down, inappropriate applications of ideas, to explain dysfunctional settlement management, to explain poverty to a meaning extent in the contemporary city. But on the other hand, we have people like Mandani to argue, and I would side here with Mandani, to say really what we've got is actually a malformation or failure at the local scale. Modernism for him is an incomplete project in the African context. Basically, we get the end of the colonial period, but we don't get the effective formation of a modern state. We get national governments, but we don't get local governments. And what we do is we leave in place a set of competing rationalities of governance. And for him, it's the leaving the mix, the mess. He doesn't actually say this. This is my words in imputing to his argument. It's leaving this ambiguity where we have competing systems of modern and pre-modern governance, particularly at the urban scale, that helps us understand this functionality. I think that's really, really useful. So you may say, so why has everybody been so quick to damn urban planning and modernism? I think there are some reasons, but I think, and I'll tell you what they are in a second, but basically what I'm suggesting is that we've conflated degrees. And we've been too quick to think, Europeans use private property as an instrument of subjugation. You know that at a national scale, at a continental scale. And arguably the land grab debates that are going on at the moment are a replay of exactly that kind of thing. And they used those instruments, which were modernist instruments. They were tied to cadastral systems, to a system of land registration, to a system that had a logic that was absolutely quintessentially tied up with scientific modernism. And they overlaid that with ideas about zoning. So quintessentially modernist instrument. In other words, they used the management of land, and they used modernist tools to appropriate land in important kinds of ways. But I think to suggest that that was modernism is for me deeply problematic, not least because I would come back to Mandani's argument to argue that what was really problematic was that they didn't do it in a way that was universal. It didn't extend to anybody. And the way that they used modernism was simply to apply it to a selected minority of people and to apply it, I go back to my earlier point, differentially to different people even within the so-called racial category. Okay? And if you're worrying about what I'm meaning by that, just think about what it means. How many of you are old enough to remember what section 10.1 ABC means? Meaning a couple of old people. Under section 10.1a, you were, if you were born in an urban area, you could stay there. If you're in section 10.1b, you had to be 10 to 15 years for a single employer. So God forbid you would change your employer. Under section 10.1c, different. Under section 10.1b, you only got rights to be there temporarily. All African people under the old race classification. In other words, they use the arguments differently. And we see that time and time again in this discourse. And so what happens is that modernism is treated very, very differently. May I remind you that the welfare state that we are all busy weeping for under the impact of neoliberalism was a very direct product of modernism. Okay, so what welfare means in Europe and what welfare means in South Africa, and what welfare means to a white South African or a black South African, or different kinds of black South Africans at that time means very, very different kinds of things. So my argument here is that modernism is absolutely critical, but perhaps not in a very crude, monolithic kind of way. And we need to perhaps come back to a revisionist argument to look at this. We need a very different kind, a very, very different kind of thinking about universality and about what we're wanting to build. And of course, the conditions which we're looking at now are that much more complex. And we know, and again, this is when I'm working with Sophie because I think it provides us with a way to think much more constructively. Just as we used to think crudely in terms of black and white, I think thinking in crude terms of formal and informal is less than helpful. And I think her mode of writing helps us to think about that, and we can come back to that. So, the 1995 piece basically argues is that using this idea of race, problematic, even in South Africa, which is the archetypal case of residential segregation. And if we are going to have a look at what race means, noting, as Sophie's just so eloquently spelled out for us, that the end product of discrimination is one that is visceral, one that is enduring, one that is embedded both in place and in the management systems which operate in places. We have to get beyond the talk of race. And the argument is, I'm saying, is that we have removed every reference to the word race in South Africa, and many of the instruments of differentiation persist. And that's because it was such an incredibly sophisticated system designed to differentiate place. So we need to go back and understand what it is exactly that we're doing. And so I start that by, in this paper's own, we start that by saying we need to rethink what we mean by the term urban segregation, and to point out that urban segregation is not just racial segregation. And that particularly in South African cities, we're up to 90% of the population that lives in them. I think Joburg's population is now 12% so-called white. Okay. We're not using a crude category like race as the only instrument to talk about 90% of the population. It seems to me you're not beginning to get to those nuances. Also, it's not just about housing. We know that many of the drivers of segregation are embedded in the mechanisms of other things like transportation and recreational space. So this much more nuanced understanding is absolutely imperative. And we need to look then at how segregation or differentiation, place-based differentiation, manifests within and between these so-called categories, if we are to surface questions of privilege. And this is particularly true, and again, I think you'll see the resonance here with Sophie's piece, when we begin to understand that as the state has become less and less powerful, and the processes of allocation are mediated by very different kinds of categories of people, whether that's chiefs, whether that's the private sector, whether that's gangs, whatever it is, these multi-governance systems mean that we actually have to understand who, what, why, what the distributional mechanisms are. We might want to go back to data, perhaps, rather than anybody else in terms of understanding distributive kinds of mechanisms. And so I'm conscious of my time. I think I might wind up there.
You've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, then let me carry on. What I then we go on to do is to say, so how do we begin to do that? What do we actually need to look at? And the first thing, point to make is that the first thing you have to be able to do if you want to understand place, particularly as an urbanist, is you've got to get over yourself on the question of what we call providers. In other words, if you have a look at the post-apartheid period, many of the things which have remained intact and unchallenged, like the land use zoning schemes, okay, arise out of the fact that the Department of Land Affairs sees land as a rural issue. There is a dominant discourse about land distribution that is rural in its orientation. Land falls under COGTA. It is part and parcel of a headspace that does not see urban land as an asset and which does not see the African as an urbanite. Now, in fact, apartheid ideologues from this institution would be delighted at this, because that, in fact, is the very logic of apartheid planning. That the so-called African would only minister to the needs of the white man, and when they had done that, they would return to rural areas and would never be considered urban. So the first thing it seems to me, if we are to seriously embrace the idea of moving to a less segregated form and one where race has less resonance, is to ensure that we embrace the idea of the African and the African city and the African university. That means taking cities seriously, and this government has never done that. They have rejected a national urban strategy 3 times, and they're really explicitly and overtly anti-urban in its discourse. We can talk about why that politics is there. The second thing we have to do is that we have to concede that even when you remove race-based planning, you still sit with dual systems of land use management. My favorite example of this is from work I was doing up in Durban. Anyone from Durban? Okay, Kwamashu Spa has the highest turnover of any spa. You know what I mean, spa? Like 7-Eleven spa? Has the highest turnover of any spa anywhere in the country. It is located on tribal land. I mean, we will trust. Because of this, it pays no rates and taxes. None. We have 3 million houses that have been built under IDP housing. We have not included any of those in the new rates and taxes. We have a whole set of urban places where there are no effective mechanisms of urban governance, or where there are competing systems of urban governance, because we have failed to acknowledge that there are dual systems. Now, this is not just about the distinction between so-called tribal land and modern urban planned land. One of the most important distinctions that Apartheid introduced under the guise of modern urban planning was one set of regulations for white areas and another for so-called township areas. And the problem with that is that we reinforced that. So areas in the post-apartheid period where we were trying desperately, quickly to deliver housing were exempted from any of the zoning schemes. So the exemption from these onerous, horrendous, modernist schemes meant that places which were built very quickly for IDP housing have no commercial zoning, they have no bulk infrastructure which services that commercial zoning. And so those neighborhoods will never be effective urban places, because they will never, and that's what I mean by commercial infrastructure and commercial zoning, is many of them will never be able to have enough refrigeration to get a large shopping complex. And where it has happened, it's been on an ad hoc basis. So we still have highly differentiated zoning schemes. We have not got an integrated zoning scheme, partly because we've refused to look at the question of urban land. And that's in part because we won't take on the chiefs. So the question is this about modernism, or is this about some other form of political power that we might want to talk about? So the issue of a unified system, of embracing, for me, was one of the more progressive elements of modernism, which is this idea of a universal, that we are all people with human rights, universal declaration of human rights, that we can set some notion of minimum standards. It is that idea of modernism that it seems to me we've actually got to be able to do. And until such time as that we do that, we will pretend that we have got away from questions of race. But the kinds of experiences which are entrenched in our city and in our places will continue, because we won't have addressed these universal kinds of questions, so that we are all the same under the law, that we all face the same kind of state, and that we are all entitled to universal processes. So I'd leave you with this idea of, for me, what is the issue of race and place, is that once you have used, as modernist planners in South Africa, in both the pre-apartheid and the post-apartheid period, did, once you have used racial discourse, however poorly defined, however manipulated, and however confused in its application, until you get to grips with the mechanisms through which the city was managed and begin to start to rework the real power relations of that, we will continue to sit with the legacies that we talk of in racial terms, even when race is not really the most useful way to talk about inequality.
Thank you. So our common practice here is to take a few questions, and then to just open it up, and you respond to what you wish to respond to, or throw questions back, and so we go. So I'd like to open the floor to a few questions, and I know that many of you lots to say on these issues. So please, I see Antonio's hand. Cheryl. Do you want to start, Antonio?
Thank you so much for your fantastic presentations. I have two questions. My first question is for you, Sophie. It's about what you. So you were talking about desegregation and derazcialization of South African cities, and then you mentioned the example of you mentioned Brazil, and you talk about Brazil and the question of derazcialization in Brazil, and ways in which, in Brazil, particularly in Brazil, this relationship between race and class, the extent to which class tends to replace a race in many instances. I'm just curious to know if the example of Brazil is help us to understand what is going on with this question of desegregation in South Africa. This is my first question. My second question is about modernism and modern state, because you were saying that we have to disambiguate these concepts of modernism and many other concepts that you use. So my question is, can we think of social categories such as race and class without the modern state? So it's a very short question.
Cheryl? I'm looking for more hands.
Thank you. I'm still formulating questions as well, so I hope they come out reasonably gently phrased. So I was really pleased that you moved into the rural, because all the way through I was thinking that the focus is so much on the urban, it seems, as a sort of discrete and compelling zone. And then you framed it very much in terms of the rural, but I was I need to think about them both in relationships and what's going on. But in the land sector, as in rural land, the general feeling is that the state is there's huge urban bias. So it's how one actually puts that perception, but also I think practice. I mean, I accept what you're saying, particularly perhaps post 2008, and I'm just thinking back to that date that was given through Sophie's paper. But the perception that, yeah, in practice there's urban bias, even though we're seeing a shift to sort of reinscription of the budget stands, etc., in traditional institutions now, and particularly since under Zuma, but although it started earlier. So it's how one kind of, how that complicates your analysis, perhaps. And does it just mean that the state's not thinking about anything? You know, what is it doing? Obviously, it's thinking about things, but both rural and urban are so limited. And then it's just, I mean, Durban is a very particular space, obviously, in terms of that history. So you know, and then trying to think about Durban in comparison to Cape Town, perhaps, which was being spoken about by Sophie. You know, how you would extend the argument that you were using Durban as your exemplar, and does it work elsewhere? And then just it was interesting to me. Sorry, this is perhaps the few, and I'll stop. But you didn't really, and this is again to you, so you didn't really articulate class, and it was interesting. I thought you were pointing to it in some ways in terms of, you know, race doesn't work. You were wanting to say a whole lot of other things we need to be thinking about as well. But class wasn't actually mentioned specifically and named as such. And why was that?
So, any more questions in this round, Sylvia?
Yeah, question for Sophie. I really like that paper and thinking through these practices as kind of modalities equating. But I was just curious, maybe also how that actually then works in practice, and maybe then, since we're talking about race, does race play a role in the extent to which people are successful or not, in ways that they are able to, get their name on the list, or in the ways that they negotiate or interact with local officials. Does it come through there, or are people able, or do people mobilize on other terms? Or I was just curious about that.
Okay, do you both want to see what you can respond to?
Okay. Yeah, I think your broad point about Brazil as a place in which to think through South African race class dimensions is that I think it's very selective on what literature you choose. So I don't think Tellis's work is useful there. I don't think and I'm sure I know in a Brazilian literature, the notion that Brazil is horizontally somehow overcoming racism is, really not the case in 100 ways. I do think Brazilian literature is really useful and I'm going to give quite specific sorts of illustrations. So mobilization. In a Brazilian conversation, the fact that there's protests going on right, left, and center that we take as sort of we read in quite a polemical way about that, what that says about state programs, what that says about our cities. That mobilization is normal, and mobilization, how does the state engage with mobilization? I think there's interesting stories there that Brazil helps us think about. Even around waiting, Brazil, for instance, there's a lottery in some cities. In Rio, there's a lottery around housing access to acknowledge that you can't create some sort of technical solution to this sort of need. So from practical little illustrations, from broader comparisons around how do we think about a regime in transition, and there's lots of layers that are really useful. Okay, for race and class though, yeah. No, I take the point definitely. And Sylvia, the question of how does it work in practice? So in a sense, how do you actually access housing? So one of the things about the housing registry, which in a way would be something to develop further, is that this housing registry, which has multiple variables now, of which chronology is only one of them, it actually draws a buffer around a housing project. And the buffer includes, so in the project I know very well, it includes 3 or 4 neighborhoods, and beneficiaries are selected from there. So does that act, how does it break out in that context? It in a way reinforces the geographies around it. Housing projects draw from those geographies, and sometimes they cross lots of boundaries, and other times they don't. And sometimes there are projects which are explicitly aiming for desegregation. So early bits of Dove close to the airport were explicitly organized to produce a desegregated neighborhood, but that's unusual, and that's now within this technology of how you manage this list and this waiting process, not possible. So I think that's some of the complexity. How do you access not informally, and a huge amount of this access is through calling them informal is not actually sufficient either. It's anything from networks, from from what sort of context and neighborhood processes can you engage in? Do you have access to? Okay, so that's how those modalities link out. But the reality is that most people don't have access.
Yeah, I've got this funny thing, I can't figure out whether I need my glasses or not, so bear with me. And so now the question of modernism, modern states, and the issue of social categories. No, I don't think you can get away from it. But I think that there are some quite good tools for us to pose problems, and which are quite known, and where they're fairly conventional instruments and debates on public policy, and I think we should be returning to them precisely because they're useful, because they acknowledge that how we manage spaces and places has the effect of creating social categories. In other words, race is a social construct, and I don't think anybody's denying that. But I think questions about things like how should we target? So the idea of targeting should be a universal targeting. do we make people equal if I give all the same amount, or do I make it equal so that I give you each an amount to bring it up to the same level? So a debate about targeting seems to me to be one of the important questions. And in an urban context, I'm sure I'll come to the urban more things that's really interesting. But for urban is where I'm used to working in, where inequality is high, probably one of the major things we have to deal with. That question of how do you mediate social categories is, I think, the question that we have to ask. Should you be redistributing? How much should you be redistributing? That's the one question. The other question, and again, I think monism is actually a framework within which we can ask the question, which is about how much do we put into the public domain versus how much do we target at individuals or households? And I think that the post-apartheid state made some extraordinary decisions. We have allocated about 200 to 250,000 rand per household on housing allocations, on housing subsidy, and about the same amount on other kinds of welfare grants. We've allocated almost nothing to investment in public spaces, which we illustrate. And when we think about the literature that we now talk about inequality in the city, what's the first thing that people will tell you is that it's our public spaces that lack investment, so that poor people don't have anywhere decent to go and reachable places, because the transport infrastructure is ineffective, and the nature of their public domain in their neighborhood is reduced, whether it's got. So I think that the ways that you can think about whether your interventions, what the consequences of those are going to be for the creation and the reinforcement of categories. And that can be both a productive sense of saying we're wanting to bring everybody up, or they can be targeted in the sense that we want to identify and allocate resources to particular individuals. Bearing in mind that what most states do, in fact, is to target resources to rich people. And that's certainly true of what the Southern state has done. And feel that's exactly the point about class. The net beneficiaries of the post-apartheid state have probably been car drivers. Forget about black-white. The most important infrastructure intervention has been and continues to be on roads and energy and land allocation, and that privileges car drivers. So I don't know who in the room is not a car driver, but you are the net beneficiary of those sorts of things. So it's like, what are categories in particular kinds of ways? So I don't think monism gets us around that at all, but I do think that it helps us to have the discussion about what we want to find. But Cheryl, the question then of what does that mean across an urban-rural divide? And I have to be honest, I grew up in fact, we both grew up in an era when there was very interesting discussion on really the origin of the debate there was what causes apartheid, what causes racism, and one of the big arguments was the reserve army of labor and the fact that reserves were subsidizing urban wages, and that's the origins of this argument that actually cities are privileged. And it plays out across other kinds of debates and lots of other international literature. And I don't think it's wrong, but I think it does a number of things which are problematic. First of all, it ignores the fact, as I already indicated, that actually quite a lot of people become urban residents permanently quite early on. And they are very different from people who are rural. So in a way that reinforces this urban-rural rather than black-white kind of distinction. But I think we've got locked into that discussion, and it's problematic for a number of different reasons. One is that I think that the net effect of the inability to talk about what goes on in power dynamics in rural areas, and the inability to name the real power of rural areas, and particularly the role of chiefs, and contradictory governance regimes which apply to local government chiefs. And you will be much more familiar with some of those things than I am, has meant that, and the dominance of that political faction within the ruling party, has meant that instead of places where we've had differentiated approaches, we've actually landed up with universal approaches. And in the absence of capacity to implement in rural areas, and with capacity in urban areas, quite often things like housing have been provided in urban areas, compounding the sense of urban bias. Plus, there's the age-old argument back against urban bias, the critiques of urban bias, and actually The real problem is that we've had massive urbanization, and most of that urbanization has been poor people. To the point where there are now more poor people living in cities than there are in towns. Rates of poverty are higher in rural areas. You're more likely to be poor if you live in a rural area. But the absolute numbers of people living in urban areas who are poor is high. And that's because there are more people living in cities. It's not. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing both. But I think for me, what's really interesting, why I like your question about Durban, is that in a way, in that tension over urban versus rural, I think what we've done is that we've missed the trick, which is to say, what are the underlying institutional structures, whether they operate in an urban place or a rural place, unimportant where they operate, that create inequality. And I like the example of Durban, and I like the example of something like Portugal or Winterkamp. Portugal being in an old homeland, Durban, a new local government structure where about 80% of its territory falls outside of a conventional modern zoning scheme and falls on tribal land. In fact, we've just produced a paper that's coming out in the next International Journal of Urban Research on Durban, advert, looking at what we call an elite compact, where basically what's happened is what Durban has done is, and I'm telling you, this is exactly your point, it's creating categories. So what it's basically done is it said we can't afford to roll out services to everybody. So they've drawn a red line, literally, and said if you live beyond this jurisdiction, you will not get water and sewage, you'll get something else. But you won't pay rates and taxes, you won't, and the donors will do the land allocation, and they've reached a compromise. Okay, now you could argue that that's a good thing, but you could argue that it has long-term, potentially negative consequences. And what isn't clear is that the interests in the poor have been protected in that basis. So me, what I would come back to is to say, I'm less convinced now than I used to be. I got into working on urban because I kept thinking, you know, the argument of the reserves doesn't help explain inequality in the city. It may help explain national patterns of inequality, but it doesn't help explain patterns in the city. I'm now more convinced than ever that it's not the urban versus the rural. Whether you're talking about a small town of Botshabelo or a small town somewhere else, it's about when you get hidden / competing / unconnected, hidden forms of power that we are unable to mediate, that you land up with problems. And I think the reserves did that in really important kinds of ways. The reserves are also present in the towns. And that's the important thing that we have to get to. And the fact that some land is urban and therefore land has had huge problems. But the bigger problem is that we actually haven't sorted out the regulation of land, period. That's a real issue. So for me, they kind of come together, and I think now more than ever, they are potentially one and the same, and that's not because we've now got a system of migrant labor or that kind of connectivity. We need to governance connectivity. And we see that acting out in political parties and in our institutional and regulatory regimes in all sorts of ways. So I don't know if that makes sense. So rambling, but yeah, I suppose that juxtaposition for me is less comfortable than it was before. And I think we could have a really productive discussion between the urban and rural land people. Yeah, we need it. Yeah, we do. I agree.
Okay, so second round, I've seen Lloyd, Rita, Renette, Joanne, Thomas. I also have a question, but I can leave it for later as well. Lloyd.
Thanks. Why don't you talk more specifically about the metropolitan city as a new kind of stakeholder and very large part of what complex of this? I have two kind of thoughts in mind here. One is the extent to which it's now being quite recently targeted as a more realistic domain by other opposition parties. And the other is the extent to which, in many ways, a key original motivating factor for legacy peace was some kind of post-racial redress, and at a symbolic level that works. I mean, I think I'm from Port Elizabeth, really from Port Elizabeth, and Port Elizabeth exists, quite explicitly in census geography as a what do you call it? Major place, not a sub-place. If you look at it, it's the old Apartheid city. It's kind of still the jigsaw puzzle is practically there. They want to, at a symbolic level, it is significant. But, what does it mean for our sense of the state?
Okay. I just want to say I come here as a literary scholar. I'm Peter Barnard with correspondent. And sometimes I just find it so interesting to hear where the connects and the disconnects lie. So when Sue talks about modernism, I know modernism, that's Joyce and Kafka. It's not actually talking about modernity. But I was so struck by your paper and how it corresponds to some of the things that that seem to me to be emerging in literary studies. And we're very inspired by David Scott's wonderful book, Omens of Adversity, and the reflections on time and the experience of temporality, and really the experience of post-revolutionary temporality. And I think you found such a beautiful, very nitty-gritty way to speak about that in your meditations on waiting. Waiting as precisely post-revolutionary temporality. So I don't know if this opens up further reflection, but I just did want to maybe share it.
I just want to kind of bring the discussion to Stellenbosch. How do you see, especially from that modernist planning perspective, how do you see race and place in Stellenbosch? And then also maybe thinking of, especially of informal settlements, the informality, and I don't know if there's any way that kind of that urbanizing population will ever reach something like central Stellenbosch or central Franschhoek, because that's always going to be just on the outskirts. So just how do you imagine thinking about that?
I can see it for you. I just wanted to thank you both for really thought-provoking talks. I was lots of things going off in my head as you were talking. So really interesting talks. And I have, I guess, a comment/question for both of you. So I was really interested in this idea of waiting, and as I was reading the paper, I was thinking about all the other kinds of waiting, like waiting in a line at a clinic, and waiting for the bus that never comes because the buses have been burned because there's a strike, or waiting for your protection order to come through, and how all these different kinds of waiting compound. So it's not just waiting for the house, it's all the other kinds of waiting, and what happens when you're tired of those different kinds of waiting, or what are the consequences of the kind of compounding of different kinds of waiting. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's just something that came to mind as I was reading your paper. And then I'm really interested in this idea of sort of different regimes of political authority, or different patterns of political authority, and how they operate and are enmeshed with one another, how they can conflict, and how they're not often legible, or maybe not surfaced. And within that, the role of different kinds of mediators, which may be in the interest of modernism in the progressive sense, or not, right? And in the urban context, how these are spatially specific. So if you look at armed actors as a kind of mediator, what is the sort of pattern of political authority that flows from that? And I guess my question is around, there's obviously a very complex interaction between the different faces of the state and this differentiated social landscape with these competing forms of political authority. How are they being shifted? Because they're not static, they don't stand still. My research interest is in the role of violence and how they're being shifted. But I think that there are probably other things, and I'd be interested to know what your sense is of how they change, particularly as you were talking about the role of planning. So that's the question.
Thomas?
Okay, I'll just squeeze it in. I was really struck by this invocation to modernism. Let's return to modernism. Never mind. Critically, yes, critically. So it's this notion of actual existing modernism versus. modernism as a project, but we could equally say that the individual, and you refer to many individuals, is equally a project. The human is a project. These are imaginaries which...
The human is really, and the individual is a deeply modern idea.
Yeah, exactly. And so here we sit in the fruits of modernism, the idea that we could sit and debate in this highly rational way and achieve some kind of insight. You used a phrase, perhaps unintentionally, of modernist and pre-modern forms of governance articulating, and that I was so struck by that because that's that old debate in South Africa about the articulation of modes of production. And is that what are you invoking that particular argument? Are we back at that point, or are we doing it as in some other form? So when we bring up the chiefs, when we bring up trust, tribal land, these are the fruits of governance. Are they the fruits of governance? Sorry, modernism. Are they the fruits of modernism simply and unavoidably? Are they the fruits of bad modernism as it was implemented but not properly? And so when you ask for a critical return to a critical modernism, I've just been at a workshop all week discussing what critical might mean, and we use it in every second word. What are we left with? From a strongly anthropological point of view, we sit with that contradiction of we want to hammer out terms that can arrive us at more robust concepts, but we find that the universal is ever more elusive. And so when the literature is so fascinating for having provided descriptions of very alternative ontologies of the city, of subjectivities, of modes of being in the city, that if you allow oneself a perspective that moves beyond the straight planning perspective, then it explodes with diversity and heterogeneity. I really liked Sophie's invocation of race as interwoven threads, because the interwoven in a way allows for more play, as fabric does, and I'm wondering how that stretchy fabric sits alongside the modernist, even some kind of critical modernist articulation.
Stephen's indicated that he wants to jump in.
No, let's leave. We'll have a discussion later.
We have a reading group after, so there's a lot to pick what you want to respond to, and we can pick up more later. So.
As Thomas had this, the stadium with its like mesh fixed the see-through fabric. That's maybe both incredibly modernist and not exactly what you're talking about. Thank you very much. I don't know David Scott's work, so I'm going to go and find that. And yeah, I think the combination of both your comments on how this weighting, for geographers thinking about temporalities is really new, and so I've really enjoyed thinking about that in a context where space is sort of the a priori sort of language around which we think about, how identity is shaped and how cities are remade. So I'm going to go and explore that literature. I think on the waiting, when you were talking, I was thinking of waiting for the police, waiting for the ambulance, waiting. The point about all of these layers of waiting, things that we know material realities, but how they're then engaged and understood, and how provisional. This is a very crass way of putting it, but how people then make their way through those experiences and the sorts of agency and the sorts of political possibilities that are in there. So in Jeffrey's work in particular, this possibility of thinking about both the subjectivities that those experiences create, but also the political possibilities in them is for me really useful. And I just wanted to connect to your comment to Sue, because they also these of how you make sense of waiting and how you make sense of this compounded nature of it also is how you make legible authority, state, the nature of the context and the place that you're in. And I mean, I guess it's clear in what I was presenting, but that's a sort of take which I find really compelling in a literature on thinking about the state. Taking that question of legibility and then, in a way, to use Thomas's metaphor again, stretching it and thinking creatively in that conceptual and lived space.
Yeah. No, I mean, that leads on very nicely, because I was going to say, and I find your provocation really useful. I'm trying to write something at the moment which comes to try to grapple with this question of what would be a capable and a responsive state. And it comes out of a place which says, I think, and Thomas, this goes to your point, I think actually I've taken a normative position that says that the state is deeply flawed, that modernity is deeply flawed. For some very strong moral and ideological reasons, I would go there, not least of those is gender equity. And some form of transferability, and the fact that actually I think at the end of the day, if I have to make a choice between, let's broadly call it a modern rationality and a pre-modern one, that's the side of the line I'll be on. Having said that, that notion of critical modernism, I think, is really important, because all we hear about, and so we should, is that the delivery mechanisms are not fair. They are not effective. They don't actually reach their target population. They do have unintended consequences. They must be reformed. They get embedded in problematic kinds of ways. So, and I absolutely buy all of those kinds of things. But I think as soon as you start to say, in essence, do you really think we should have a state or not? Do you really think that all people are the same or not? And it's precisely because of our history of racism that I would actually go to the universal, and I would say there is a universal condition where we are all the same, and we should all ideally be treated the same. So I go back to, so it is a much more strongly normative base. It's absolutely in opposition to a lot of what's been in the academic literature for the last 10 to 20 years. So I think that's the context within which I would embrace that. And it's from that then that it seems to me that the intellectual task that lies before us, and the political task, is one which is quite technical sometimes. So it goes exactly to questions like power functions. Who does what? What is the point of metropolitan government? What are the best ways that you could integrate a settlement? And I think once you begin to start to think about that, accepting in some senses some of those constraints, you begin to look at things very differently. And I mean, the Stellenbosch case for me would be typical of almost every place in South Africa, which is that the failure to reform the land use zoning system and the failure to actually put in place some standards which said that the elite may not spread into particular kinds of places is what has driven the post-apartheid reform. The fact that we went for a highly individualized housing subsidy based on a home ownership mechanism, which in turn depended on state subsidy allocations, which have entrenched the programs that we've got, which were done in the name of racial redistribution, when in fact they were not. They were exactly the antithetical purpose for it, is exactly why we landed in that thing. And so it's that imperative to engage the technical as well as the ideological that I think that the understanding of place gives you, which is not for a moment to move away from the ephemeral, the experiential, the interpretive. The essence of our political and personal experience is one that cannot be negated, and it should be understood through other kinds of forms, whether they're cultural or philosophical or any of those things. But it seems to me that similarly, to suggest that the management system and the finance mechanisms that we have and the size and state of the state make no difference to our long-term experience of inequality is simply silly. And so I suppose it's in that context that I think some of us have to become really bored in public admin and management and planning type people. So,
Okay. Well, thank you all. I'll remind you that there is a reading group in about 20 minutes, and that we can pick up these issues. And thanks all of you for coming, and thanks to you two for coming time. This is a wonderfully stimulating event. And thanks.